My own son told me I wasn't family anymore and banned me from the cruise I'd paid for with $8,500 of my own money, so I made one phone call that changed everything. My name is Barbara Reynolds. I'm 73 years old, and I thought I knew who my son was. For 50 years, I built a life alongside my husband Richard, a civil engineer who worked himself to the bone so we could give our boy David every advantage. We paid for his education, helped him through rough patches, celebrated his wedding to Stephanie 5 years ago, even though something in my gut told me that girls saw dollar signs instead of love. Richard passed 4 years back, leaving me our paid-off home in Portland and close to $900,000 in assets we'd accumulated through decades of sacrifice and smart decisions. I thought David understood what family meant. I thought raising him with values would stick. I thought wrong. 2 weeks before what was supposed to be a beautiful 15-day Caribbean cruise, the one I'd booked and paid for completely, 3 luxury cabins, excursions, drink packages, everything, my son called me with words that still make my chest tight when I remember them. He told me the cruise would be just for family now. When I reminded him that I was family, that he'd specifically asked me to come, he laughed. Actually laughed. Then he said something I'll never forget, that technically Stephanie's parents were family now, and I'd already had my life, so I should let them enjoy theirs. 73 years on this earth, decades of marriage, raising a child, burying my husband, working alongside Richard for 46 years to build something meaningful. And my son dismissed me like I was a piece of old furniture he'd outgrown. But here's what David forgot. His old, confused mother still had her name on every single document for that cruise. Every cabin, every excursion, every last cent was on my credit card. What I did next, some people might call ruthless. I call it self-respect. And by the time that ship sailed, my son learned an expensive lesson about what happens when you treat your elderly mother like an ATM instead of a human being. If you want to hear how a 73-year-old widow taught her ungrateful son about consequences, stay with me, because this story gets better or worse, depending on whether you're me or David. And I promise you, what happened next was worth every single moment of pain he put me through. I need to take you back 3 months before that devastating phone call. Because that's when I should have seen the warning signs. That's when the cracks in my son's character started showing, but I was too busy being a mother to notice I was being played. It was a Sunday afternoon, in March, when David showed up at my house unannounced. Now, my son lived 40 minutes away in Beaverton, and spontaneous visits weren't his style anymore, not since Stephanie entered the picture. She kept him on a tight schedule, always had plans, always needed him somewhere. So when he walked through my door with that bright smile and a bouquet of grocery store flowers, my heart did what any mother's heart would do. It swelled with hope that maybe, just maybe, I was getting my boy back. We sat in the kitchen where I'd made him thousands of meals growing up, where Richard used to help him with homework at that same table, and David talked about how well things were going. His job in sales was taking off. Stephanie had expensive taste, but it's worth it, and they were really building something. Then came the pivot, smooth as butter. He mentioned their 5th wedding anniversary coming up in June, how Stephanie had always dreamed of a cruise, how it would mean the world to celebrate this milestone properly. I remember feeling a flutter of concern when he mentioned the cost, around $8,000 or $9,000 for what he was describing. That's not pocket change, not even for someone with my late husband's careful investments. But David knew exactly what to say. He reached across that table, took my weathered hand in his, and told me that they wanted me there with them, that it wouldn't be a real celebration without me. That Stephanie specifically said I should come because family is everything. Family is everything. Those 3 words did their job. I'd been lonely since Richard passed. 4 years of waking up in an empty house. 4 years of playing bridge with my friends while watching them enjoy their grandchildren. 4 years of watching David pull further and further away. The idea of 2 weeks on a ship with my son, maybe rebuilding what we'd lost, maybe finally connecting with my daughter and Lit, felt like a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. So I said yes. Not just yes to paying, but yes to hoping. Yes to believing that at 73 years old, I could still have the family closeness I'd dreamed about. David's face lit up like I'd handed him a winning lottery ticket. He hugged me tight, called me the best mom in the world, promised it would be unforgettable. Then he pulled out his phone right there at my kitchen table and started showing me cruise options. The excitement in his voice sounded so genuine that I pushed away the small voice in my head, the one that sounded suspiciously like Richard asking why David couldn't contribute to his own anniversary celebration. Within an hour, we'd picked out the cruise. 15 days, leaving from Miami, hitting 7 Caribbean islands. David insisted on the luxury cabins because you deserve the best, Mom, and Stephanie gets seasick easily, so she needs a bigger room. He wanted the excursion packages, the premium drink packages, the specialty dining. Every time I hesitated at the climbing costs, he'd squeeze my hand and remind me this was a once-in-a-lifetime family experience. By the time he left that evening, I'd put down a deposit of $3,000. He kissed my cheek at the door, told me he loved me, said he'd call soon to finalize the rest of the details. I watched his car pull away and felt something I hadn't felt in years needed, important, like I still mattered in my son's life. What a fool I was. Over the next 2 months, there were more visits, but they all followed the same pattern. David would show up, charm me with stories about work or his plans, then casually mention another expense for the cruise. An upgraded cabin became necessary because Stephanie needed more space. Then her parents wanted to come too, so we needed a third cabin. Then the excursion package needed to be expanded. Each time, I transferred money, and each time, David made me feel like I was investing in our relationship, not just writing checks. I should have noticed that these visits only happened when money was needed. I should have questioned why a man with a taking-off sales career needed his elderly mother to fund his entire vacation. I should have listened to Helen when she raised an eyebrow over coffee and asked if David had even sent me a birthday card this year. He hadn't. But I didn't want to see it, because seeing it would mean accepting that the sweet boy I'd raised, the one who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and tell me I was the prettiest mom at school pickup, had turned into someone who viewed his widowed mother as nothing more than a source of funding. The final payment came in early May, $8,500 total, all said and done. I remember sitting at my computer, my finger hovering over the confirm button, and feeling Richard's absence like a physical ache. He would have asked harder questions. He would have made David contribute. But Richard wasn't there. And I was just a lonely old woman who wanted to believe her son still loved her. I clicked confirm. David sent a text 20 minutes later. Thanks, Mom. This is going to be amazing. Family trip of a lifetime. I saved that text. Later, I'd need it. The cruise was scheduled for June 15th. I marked it on my calendar in red pen, counted down the days like a kid waiting for Christmas. I bought new clothes for the trip, got my hair done, even splurged on a new suitcase. Helen watched me prepare with worried eyes but said nothing. What could she say that I'd be willing to hear? Then came that Tuesday afternoon in late May, June 1st, to be exact. 2 weeks before departure. I was in my garden, working on the roses Richard had planted for our 30th anniversary, when my phone rang. David's name on the screen made me smile. I brushed the dirt off my hands and answered, expecting him to discuss final details. Maybe what time we'd meet at the airport. What I got instead ripped open a wound I didn't know I had. His voice was different. Flat, cold, like he was talking to a telemarketer instead of his mother. He said we needed to discuss a change in plans regarding the cruise. My stomach dropped before he even finished the sentence. I stood there among Richard's roses, dirt under my fingernails, while my son explained that they'd decided the cruise should be just for immediate family. When I reminded him, my voice shaking, that I was immediate family, he actually sighed, like I was being difficult, like I was the problem. That's when he said it, that Stephanie's parents were coming instead, that 3 cabins for 3 generations would be too crowded, that I'd already had my life and should let them enjoy theirs. He said it so casually, like he was discussing the weather, like he wasn't severing something fundamental between us. I asked him if he remembered who paid for this cruise. He had the audacity to say that my contribution was appreciated, but this was their anniversary, and they got to decide who celebrated with them. Contribution? Like I'd chipped in $20 for pizza. My hands started shaking. I asked him point blank, David, are you really uninviting your mother from a trip she paid for completely so your wife's parents can go instead? There was a pause. Then, Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're retired. You can travel anytime. This is important to us. Something crystallized in that moment, standing in the garden my dead husband had planted, holding a phone to my ear while my son erased me from his life. Richard used to say that people show you who they rue, just have to be willing to look. I'd been refusing to look for 5 years, maybe longer. I was done refusing. I told David I needed to think about it and hung up before he could say another word. My legs barely carried me inside. I sat at the kitchen table, that same table where he'd held my hand and promised this would be unforgettable, and I let myself cry for exactly 10 minutes. I allowed myself that. Richard always said that feelings were valid, but drowning in them was a choice. Then I dried my eyes, pulled out my phone, and called the one person I knew would understand. Helen answered on the second ring. Helen Morris has been my best friend for 42 years. We met when our husbands worked together on a bridge construction project back in 1983. And we bonded over terrible coffee at a company barbecue while watching our kids run around like wild animals. Her daughter Melissa pulled something similar 3 years ago, drained Helen's savings with promises of investments, and then cut her off when the money dried up. So when I called her that afternoon, voice still thick from crying, she didn't waste time with platitudes. She told me to come over immediately and to bring every document I had related to the cruise. I drove to Helen's house in a daze, my mind cycling through decades of memories. David as a toddler, climbing into my lap with scraped knees. David graduating high school, hugging me so tight I could barely breathe. David at his father's funeral, holding my hand through the service. How did that boy become the man who just discarded me like trash? Helen met me at her door with tea already brewing. She knew I'd need it. We sat in her living room, the same one where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays and every major life event for 4 decades, and I showed her everything. The booking confirmation, all in my name. The credit card statements showing every payment. The text messages from David thanking me and calling it a family trip of a lifetime. Helen read through it all with the methodical attention of someone who'd learned the hard way to document everything. When she finished, she looked at me with an expression that mixed anger and sadness in equal measure. She told me this wasn't just cruel, it was a pattern she'd seen before. Adult children who view their aging parents as resources to be extracted and then discarded. Then she said something that changed everything. Barbara, I know someone who can help, not just with the cruise, but with protecting yourself going forward. That's how I met Patrick Donovan. Helen called him right then, put the phone on speaker. Patrick was the attorney who'd helped her when Melissa tried to claim Helen was incompetent to manage her own finances. A common tactic, he explained, when adult children want control of their elderly parents' money. His voice was calm but firm, and he asked me questions that made me realize just how deep this went. Had David ever suggested I was forgetful or confused around others? Yes, at his last birthday dinner, he'd laughed and told Stephanie's parents I was getting mixed up more and more these days when I'd corrected him about a story. I thought it was just a joke. Had he asked about my will or estate planning? Yes, multiple times in the past year, always framed as just wanting to make sure you have things in order. Mom. Had there been other times he'd asked for money and then pulled away after receiving it? My stomach churned as I mentally tallied them up. The loan for his car down payment 3 years ago, never repaid. The emergency dental work for Stephanie, $5,000. The investment opportunity that never materialized, each time followed by weeks of silence. Patrick told me something that made my blood run cold. He said that financial exploitation of elderly parents by their own children was becoming an epidemic, and it often started exactly like this: Cecily the parent, questioning their mental capacity, extracting resources, and then discarding them. He said he'd seen it dozens of times, and it always escalated. He asked me a question that felt like a punch to the gut. Barbara, do you think your son would try to have you declared incompetent if you resisted him? I wanted to say no. Every maternal instinct in me wanted to defend David, to say my son would never go that far. But I remembered his voice on the phone, cold and dismissive. I remembered him calling my payment a contribution. I remembered 5 years of increasing distance and decreasing respect. I told Patrick I didn't know anymore, and that terrified me. He said we needed to act strategically. First, we'd document everything: my mental competency, my financial decisions, the pattern of David's behavior. Second, we'd deal with the immediate cruise situation in a way that protected me legally and financially. Third, we'd review my estate planning, because if David saw me as a piggy bank now, it would only get worse as I got older and potentially more vulnerable. Helen squeezed my hand while Patrick talked, and I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about a cruise anymore. This was about my autonomy, my dignity, My right to live out my remaining years without being manipulated by someone who was supposed to love me unconditionally. We set up a meeting for the next morning. Patrick told me not to respond to David yet, not to tip my hand. He said that people like my son were counting on their elderly parents being too confused, too scared, or too emotionally attached to fight back. But I was none of those things. I was angry. After I hung up with Patrick, Helen made us dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and salad, and we talked for hours. She told me about the guilt she'd felt when she finally cut Melissa off, how she'd worried people would think she was a bad mother. She told me that society puts impossible expectations on parents, especially mothers, to endure any treatment because family is family. Then she said something I needed to hear. Barbara, you didn't stop being David's mother when you decided to respect yourself. He stopped being your son when he decided to use you. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Richard, wondering what he'd say. He'd always been tougher on David than I was, pushed him to be self-sufficient, refused to bail him out of every problem. I'd sometimes accused Richard of being too hard on our son. Now I wondered if he'd seen something I'd been too blind to notice. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and went to Richard's study, still called it that, even though he'd been gone for years. I pulled out the file cabinet where he'd kept all our important documents, organized with the precision of an engineer. Our will was there, drafted 20 years ago. David was listed as the primary beneficiary of everything: the house, the investments, the life insurance proceeds that I hadn't touched. I did the math. After my death, David stood to inherit somewhere around $600,000, maybe more depending on market performance. $600,000 from parents he clearly had no respect for. That's when the fury really hit me. Not the hot, explosive kind, the cold, calculated kind that comes from decades of life experience, the kind that knows how to plan and execute. I went back to bed with a plan forming in my mind. If David wanted to treat me like I was nothing more than money, then I'd show him exactly what that money could do when it was in the hands of someone he'd underestimated. The next morning, I arrived at Patrick Donovan's office at 9 sharp. He was younger than I expected, maybe 50, with kind eyes that had clearly seen their share of family ugliness. His office wall had certificates and diplomas, but also photos of him with what looked like his own elderly parents, both smiling. He walked me through everything methodically. First, we scheduled a complete cognitive assessment with a neuropsychologist, not because I needed it, but because I needed documentation that I was fully competent. He explained that if David ever tried to claim I was mentally unfit, this evaluation would destroy his credibility. Second, we reviewed the crew's documentation. Patrick smiled when he saw that everything, every single reservation, every payment, every confirmation was in my name only. David wasn't listed as a Kobuka or Kopea anywhere. It was all mine. Patrick explained my options. I could cancel everything and demand a refund, but there would be cancellation fees this close to departure. I could force David to honor the original plan, but that would mean spending 2 weeks on a ship with a son who clearly didn't want me there. This is where Patrick's smile widened. I could exercise my right as the sole booker to modify the reservation as I saw fit. He asked me if I had anyone I'd actually want to travel with. People who respected me, who valued my company, who wouldn't see me as an ATM with gray hair. I thought of Helen. I thought of our bridge group: Diane, Margaret, Patricia, and Susan. 5 women between 68 and 79, who'd known each other for decades, who'd supported each other through husbands' deaths and children's disappointments and the general indignity of being dismissed by a society that thinks women expire at menopause. I told Patrick I did. He leaned back in his chair and laid out the plan. I would cancel the 3 cabins David had requested, all in my name, all paid with my money. I would immediately rebook the cruise for myself and 5 friends. The cancellation would trigger a significant fee for rebooking this slate, which David would discover when he tried to board. He'd have to pay out of pocket if he still wanted to go, and at this point, it would cost him close to $15,000. Then Patrick suggested something that made my heart race. We should also revise my will immediately, not as punishment, he was careful to say, but as protection. If David was willing to discard me this easily now, what would he try when I was older, perhaps actually needing care? The will shouldn't be about revenge, it should be about directing my assets to people and causes that actually aligned with my values. I sat in that office for 3 hours. We documented everything: mails, texts, phone calls, the pattern of financial requests. Patrick recorded my statement about the cruise situation while I was calm and clear-headed. We scheduled the cognitive assessment for 2 days later, and then we rewrote my will. Richard and I had built our estate over 46 years of work. Every dollar represented sacrifice meals, packed instead of bought, vacations delayed, repairs done ourselves. We'd envisioned it supporting our son, maybe helping our grandchildren if we were blessed with any. But David had no children, seemed to have no plans for any, and based on his behavior, I wouldn't trust him to teach them values anyway. Patrick helped me establish something Richard would have loved, a foundation for scholarships in engineering, specifically for students from working-class families, like we'd been. The bulk of my estate would go there, creating opportunities for young people who understood the value of hard work. I also designated a significant portion to organizations fighting elder abuse and financial exploitation. If my painful lesson could help protect other mothers from their own children, maybe it meant something. As for David, Patrick suggested leaving him exactly $8,500, the amount of the cruise he felt so entitled to take without me. It would make my intentions crystal clear, while avoiding any accusations of accidentally forgetting him. When we finished, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Patrick told me he'd handle the cruise modifications immediately, and advised me not to tell David anything yet. Let him discover it naturally. Let him feel the shock I'd felt. I drove home in a daze, this time a different kind. I called Helen from my car and told her to reach out to the bridge. Lady's Eye was taking them all to the Caribbean, my treat, and I wouldn't accept any arguments. Helen laughed so hard she snorted, then told me she'd always known I had steel in my spine. It just took the right provocation to find it. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 4 years. I sat in Richard's chair in his study, poured myself 2 fingers of his favorite whiskey, and talked to him like he was still there. I told him about David, about the cruise, about everything. I apologized for being too soft, for not seeing what he'd probably noticed years ago. And I made him a promise. I wouldn't let our son turn me into a victim. I wouldn't spend my remaining years, however many I had left, being manipulated and diminished. The money we'd earned together would go to people who deserved it, and I'd live out my days with dignity intact. The whiskey burned going down, but it felt like Richard's approval. 2 days later, I sat through 3 hours of cognitive testing, memory, reasoning, decision-making, everything. The neuropsychologist, Dr. Sandra Chen, was thorough and kind. When she finished, she told me my scores were in the superior range for my age group. She actually seemed impressed by my recall of events from decades ago and my ability to solve complex problems. She asked me why I needed this evaluation, and I told her the truth. Her expression hardened with recognition. Apparently, she'd seen this pattern before too. She wrote me a comprehensive report, noting specifically that I showed no signs of cognitive impairment and was fully capable of managing my own affairs and making my own decisions. Patrick filed it with the rest of my documentation. I was bulletproof now. The cruise modifications went through without a hitch. I called each of the bridge ladies personally. Diane cried and said she'd never been on a cruise. Margaret asked 3 times if I was serious. Patricia and Susan insisted on contributing something. But I refused. This was my gift, my choice, my way of surrounding myself with real family. Helen and I went shopping for cruise clothes together, giggling like teenagers. I bought a bright red swimsuit that Richard would have loved and 3 sundresses that made me feel attractive instead of invisible. At 73, I was reclaiming something I hadn't even realized I'd lost. The departure date crept closer. David texted me a few times, casual messages asking if I was excited, telling me they'd finalized their packing. He had no idea. I kept my responses brief and pleasant. Patrick had told me to act normal, not to give anything away. June 14th arrived. Tomorrow morning, my friends and I would fly to Miami. Tonight, David would discover what happens when you forget that your elderly mother has a spine made of the same steel your father worked with for 46 years. I was in my bedroom, packing the last few items, when my phone rang. David's name flashed on the screen, but this time, my heart didn't flutter with hope, it clenched with satisfaction. I let the phone ring 3 times before answering. Patrick had coached me on this. Don't seem too eager. Don't seem angry. Just be calm, neutral. Let David reveal himself without any help from me. His voice came through frantic, higher pitched than I'd ever heard it. He told me there was a problem with the cruise, that the company had called him saying the reservations were canceled, that there was some kind of error in the system. He needed me to call them right away because they were saying something about the bookings being modified by the account holder. I sat down on my bed, next to my half-packed suitcase with the bright red swimsuit folded on top, and asked him what exactly the cruise line had said. He stumbled over his words, clearly caught off guard that I wasn't immediately panicking with him. They'd told him that the original 3-cabin reservation had been cancelled and rebooked under different names. They'd told him that, as of now, he had no reservation at all. And because it was less than 24 hours before departure, if he wanted to book new cabins, it would cost nearly $15,000, almost double what I'd originally paid. I let the silence stretch for a moment. Then I asked him a simple question. Had he given the cruise line his name as the primary account holder? He said no. Why would he? I'd booked everything. His voice had an edge of irritation now, like I was being deliberately obtuse. So I asked another question. Did he have any documentation showing he'd paid for any portion of this cruise? That's when his tone shifted. He told me this wasn't the time for stupid questions. There was an emergency, and I needed to fix it. He actually used the word emergency, like his ruined vacation plans ranked alongside heart attacks and house fires. I told him I'd look into it and hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from adrenaline, from the electric feeling of finally standing up for myself after 73 years of being the peacemaker, the accommodator, the good mother who never made waves. Patrick had predicted David's call would come that evening. The cruise line would have notified him as soon as the departure window hit 24 hours. Patrick had also predicted David's next move. He'd try to manipulate me emotionally, play on my love for him, make me feel guilty for whatever confusion had caused this problem. I didn't have to wait long. 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time, it was a video call. I almost didn't answer. I knew what I'd see. But I needed to witness this, needed to watch him try to manipulate me while I knew the truth. He didn't. David's face filled my screen, and behind him I could see Stephanie pacing, her expression furious. He'd clearly put on his concerned son, face, eyebrows drawn together, voice soft and careful. He told me he was worried about me, that maybe I'd gotten confused with the booking, that these websites could be tricky for people my age. There it was. People my age. Like 73 meant automatically incompetent. I told him I wasn't confused about anything, that my mind was sharp as ever. And perhaps he should explain exactly what he thought had happened. He glanced off camera at Stephanie, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. Then, he shifted tactics. His voice got warmer, more affectionate. He called me Mom in that particular way he used to as a child when he wanted something. He said he knew I'd been looking forward to this trip that we all had, and wasn't it awful that some computer glitch was threatening to ruin our family vacation? Family vacation. The same vacation he'd uninvited me from 2 weeks ago. I asked him point blank if he remembered our conversation on June 1st. The one where he told me I wasn't really family, that I'd had my life already, that Stephanie's parents were taking my place. His face went completely still. In the background, I heard Stephanie hiss, something I couldn't make out. David's jaw tightened, and for just a second, I saw rage flash across his features before he controlled it. He told me I was remembering that wrong, that I was twisting his words, that he'd simply suggested maybe I'd be more comfortable staying home given my age and health. He said it gently, like he was explaining reality to a dementia patient. And I realized with absolute clarity that this was his strategy: gaslight me into thinking I'd misunderstood, make me doubt my own memory, paint himself as the patient's son dealing with his declining mother. I told him I remembered perfectly, and in fact, I had that conversation recorded on my phone because Oregon is a one-party consent state for call recording. That wasn't entirely true. I hadn't recorded it. But Patrick had suggested planting that seed, because guilty people's imaginations would fill in the rest. David's face went pale. He asked what I was talking about. Why would I record him? What was wrong with me? Stephanie moved into frame now. Her pretty face twisted with anger, and she started to say something, but David held up his hand to stop her. He tried a different approach. His voice got harder, more authoritative. He told me that he was concerned about my behavior lately, that making up stories about recordings and canceling cruise reservations without telling anyone suggested I might not be thinking clearly. He said maybe we needed to talk about getting me some help, someone to manage my affairs, because this wasn't normal. There it was, the threat Patrick had warned me about. If I didn't comply, David would start questioning my mental competency. He'd try to paint me as a confused old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own decisions. I smiled at him through the screen. I told him that was an interesting suggestion, because just yesterday I'd completed a comprehensive cognitive evaluation with Dr. Sandra Chen, a neuropsychologist, and she'd found me to be in superior mental condition for my age, with absolutely no signs of impairment. I told him I had the full report if he'd like to see it. The silence on the other end was beautiful. Stephanie had stopped pacing. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Then I told him the truth, calm as anything. I had cancelled those reservations myself, deliberately, because I'd decided to take people who actually wanted my company. I was going on that cruise tomorrow, the cruise I'd paid for with my money, and I was taking Helen and 4 other friends, women who respected me, women who didn't see me as a wallet with a pulse. David exploded, his careful mask shattered completely. He started yelling about how ungrateful I was, how he and Stephanie had been planning this for months, how dare I sabotage their anniversary. Stephanie joined in, screaming that I was a selfish old woman, that I'd always been jealous of her relationship with David, that this proved I was mentally unstable. I let them rant. I watched my son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose college tuition I'd paid, completely lose control because he couldn't manipulate his elderly mother anymore. When they finally ran out of steam, I spoke quietly. I told David he was right about one thing: I had made a mistake. My mistake was spending 5 years pretending I didn't see what he'd become. My mistake was allowing him to treat me like an ATM while telling myself it was love. My mistake was not listening to his father, who'd tried to teach him self-sufficiency, because Richard could see the entitlement growing. David's face was red now. He threatened to sue me, said the cruise line would side with him, that everyone would see I was an unstable old woman, punishing her son for no reason. I told him to do whatever he felt he needed to do. Then I mentioned that my attorney, Patrick Donovan, would be happy to discuss any legal action with him. I gave him Patrick's number, and watched the realization dawn that this wasn't a confused old woman making rash decisions. This was planned, documented, and legally sound. Stephanie grabbed the phone from David's hand. Her face filled the screen, contorted with fury. She told me I was going to regret this, that I was destroying my relationship with my only child, that I'd die alone because of my selfishness. I looked at this woman, 20 years younger than my son, who'd never worked a day in her life, who'd helped turn my boy into someone I barely recognized. I felt nothing but pity. I told her she was probably right, that I'd damaged my relationship with David beyond repair, but I'd rather die alone with my dignity than live surrounded by people who saw me as nothing but a source of money. Then I hung up. My whole body was trembling. I sat on my bed for a long moment, staring at my phone, half expecting it to ring again. It did 7 more times that evening. I didn't answer. I did, however, save every voicemail. Each one was more desperate and more threatening than the last. Ranging from David crying about how I was breaking his heart, to Stephanie screaming legal threats, to David coldly informing me that I was no longer welcome in his life. That last one almost made me laugh, as if I'd want to be. Helen called around 9. She'd gotten a frantic call from Stephanie asking for my real phone number because clearly I'd changed it. And could Helen please talk some sense into me? Helen had told her exactly where to go, in language I won't repeat, but that made me burst out laughing for the first time in weeks. I slept well that night, better than I had in years, actually. No guilt, no second-guessing, no wondering if I'd been too harsh. Just the peaceful satisfaction of knowing I'd finally chosen myself. The next morning, Helen picked me up at 6. My suitcase was packed, my new red swimsuit ready, and my heart was lighter than it had been in 4 years of widowhood. The other ladies met us at the airport: Diane with her infectious laugh, Margaret with her terrible jokes, Patricia and Susan finishing each other's sentences like they always did. We looked like what we were, a group of elderly women heading out for adventure. Society probably saw us as invisible, past our prime, not worth noticing. David certainly had. But as we boarded that plane to Miami, I felt more seen and more valued than I had in years. These women knew my worth, and I finally knew it too. The flight to Miami felt like crossing into a new life. Helen sat beside me, squeezing my hand during takeoff the way she had on our first trip together 40 years ago when Richard and her husband, Tom, took us to Vegas for a conference. Back then, we were young wives with small children at home, stealing a weekend of freedom. Now we were widows, reclaiming something more precious, our right to joy, without permission. Margaret kept us laughing with stories about her grandson's latest chaos. Patricia and Susan debated which excursions we should book once aboard. Diane, at 79, the oldest of our group, announced she was going to learn the salsa dance even if it killed her. The pure normalcy of it, women friends traveling together, excited and silly and fully alive, made me realize how much I'd shrunk myself trying to maintain David's approval. When we landed in Miami, my phone exploded with messages. 17 texts from David, each one escalating from pleading to threatening, several from Stephanie. Even one from Stephanie's mother, a woman I'd met exactly twice, telling me I was ruining her daughter's marriage and should be ashamed. I showed Helen the messages while we waited for our luggage. She read them with her reading glasses perched on her nose, her expression hardening with each swipe. When she finished, she told me something that shifted my entire perspective. She said that when Melissa had drained her savings, the hardest part wasn't losing the money, it was accepting that her daughter was capable of that level of manipulation. She said the anger would come and go, but the grief for the relationship I'd thought I had with David would take longer to process. She was right. Standing in that Miami airport baggage claim, surrounded by my chosen family, I felt it wash over me, grief for the son who'd never really existed, or maybe had existed once but was gone now. Grief for the grandmother I'd never be, the family holidays that would never happen, the deathbed where David probably wouldn't be present unless he thought there was still money to inherit. I let myself feel it for exactly 5 minutes, checked my watch, then dried my eyes and grabbed my suitcase. Patrick had taught me something important. Feelings were valid, but wallowing was optional. I could grieve and still move forward. I could hurt and still choose joy. The ship was magnificent, 15 stories of gleaming white luxury docked against the bluest water I'd seen since Richard took me to Hawaii for our 25th anniversary. Our cabins were on the 10th floor with private balconies. The steward who helped us check in was a young man from the Philippines named Carlo who carried our bags and explained every amenity with genuine enthusiasm. When he left, the 6 of us stood on my balcony watching the port bustle with activity. Diane pointed out a couple arguing near the terminal entrance. Even from this distance, the body language was clear, angry gestures. The woman's arms crossed defensively, the man pointing aggressively. Susan made a joke about hoping they weren't on our ship. Margaret said they probably fought over something stupid like who forgot to pack the sunscreen. We all laughed, but I felt a chill run through me, because I knew exactly the kind of fight that looked like. I'd seen it in David's face through the video call, that particular rage that comes when someone feels entitled to something and has it taken away. I pushed the thought aside. This trip wasn't about David. This trip was about remembering that at 73 years old, I still had adventures left in me. That evening we had dinner at the main dining room, a gorgeous space with crystal chandeliers and waiters in crisp white jackets. Our table overlooked the ocean as the ship pulled away from port, Miami's lights growing smaller behind us. We toasted with champagne that Diane insisted on ordering, her treat. Helen raised her glass and made a speech about friendship lasting longer than marriages and meaning more than blood. I thought about Richard, wished he could see me here, happy and free and surrounded by love that asked nothing of me except that I show up as myself. The champagne was perfect. The food was exquisite. The laughter at our table made other diners turn and smile. And somewhere back in Portland, my son was learning that the mother he'd dismissed had plenty of life left to live. The first 3 days on that ship felt like emerging from a fog I hadn't known I was living in. We fell into an easy rhythm: breakfast on our balconies, watching the ocean, shore excursions exploring Caribbean islands, afternoon card games by the pool, formal dinners where we dressed up and felt elegant again. The other passengers probably saw us as a group of harmless old ladies. They had no idea we were refugees from ungrateful children, reclaiming our power, one Mai Tai at a time. But underneath the enjoyment, I was documenting everything. Patrick had been clear about this before I left: keep records of every expense, every moment, every decision I made, with perfect clarity. If David tried to paint me as incompetent or impulsive, I needed proof that this trip was carefully planned and executed by a woman in full control of her faculties. So each evening, after the others went to bed, I sat on my balcony with my laptop and typed detailed notes. I saved every receipt. I photographed our activities with times. I even kept a journal describing my thoughts and decisions, not because I thought I'd forget, but because I wanted documentation of my mental state throughout this trip. On day 4, we docked in Grand Cayman. The water was impossibly turquoise, and Diane insisted we do the Stingray excursion despite Margaret's protests that we were too old to be waiting around with sea creatures. We went anyway, and I have a photo on my phone of all 6 of us standing waist-deep in crystal water, stingrays gliding past our legs, laughing like teenagers. That evening, back on the ship, my phone finally had signal. I'd kept it off for most of the trip, ignoring the temptation to check messages, but something made me turn it on that night. 43 messages. Emails, texts, voicemails. Most from David and Stephanie, but some from numbers I didn't recognize. I poured myself a glass of wine from the bottle we'd bought on the island and started reading. The first dozen were predictable: David angry, Stephanie hysterical, both demanding I fix this situation immediately. But then the messages changed tone. David's became calculating. He'd clearly talked to someone, maybe a lawyer of his own, because he started documenting his version of events. He texted that he was concerned about my declining mental state and that canceling a family trip impulsively showed poor judgment. He mentioned he'd spoken to my neighbors about whether I seemed confused lately. My blood ran cold. He was building a case, not for the cruise he'd lost that battle and probably knew it, but for something bigger. If he could paint me as mentally incompetent, he could potentially challenge my financial decisions, maybe even seek guardianship. I called Patrick immediately, not caring that it was past midnight back in Portland. He answered on the 3rd ring. Voice alert. I told him about the messages, about David contacting my neighbors, about the pattern I was seeing. Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then he told me this was actually good news. David was making mistakes by being so obvious. Every text he sent claiming I was incompetent while I was clearly functioning perfectly well on an international cruise was evidence in my favor. Every attempt to manipulate others' perceptions could be documented. Patrick told me to forward everything to him and to keep enjoying my trip while he handled things back home. But there was something else. Patrick hesitated, then told me he'd done some digging into David's finances after our last meeting. Just basic public records. My son was in serious trouble. He had 3 credit cards maxed out, a second mortgage on his house I didn't know about, and he'd missed several car payments. The successful sales career was apparently not so successful. Suddenly, everything made sense. The cruise wasn't about celebrating an anniversary, it was about maintaining appearances while being completely broke. Stephanie's expensive taste wasn't being funded by David's income because there wasn't enough income. They'd been counting on my money, possibly for a long time, and my refusal to be used anymore had triggered a financial crisis they couldn't hide. Patrick told me something that made my heart ache, despite my anger. He said that children who financially abuse their elderly parents often escalate when the money stops flowing. David wouldn't just accept losing access to my resources, he'd fight for it, and the most effective weapon was declaring me incompetent. I needed to be prepared for a legal battle when I returned. I hung up and sat on my balcony for a long time, watching the moonlight on the water. Part of me wanted to feel guilty, to wonder if I should help David out of his financial hole. That was the mother in me, trained by decades of putting my child first. But the woman I'd become, the one Richard had wanted me to be, the one who'd finally found her spine, knew that helping him now would only enable the pattern. David needed to face the consequences of his choices, and I needed to protect myself. The next morning at breakfast, Helen took one look at my face and knew something had happened. I showed her the messages and told her about Patrick's call. She listened carefully, then told me about what her attorney had warned her with: Melissa, financial predators don't stop until they're forced to stop. We spent that day in Cozumel, exploring Mayan ruins. Our guide was a woman about my age who'd lived through poverty, revolution, and the death of 2 husbands. She talked about the ancient civilization's respect for elderly wisdom, how grandmothers were revered as keepers of knowledge. I thought about how far we'd fallen from that ideal, how modern society treats its elderly like burdens instead of treasures. That night, our group had dinner at the ship's Italian restaurant. Diane had too much wine and got philosophical, asking each of us what we'd learned from our worst heartbreaks. When it came to me, I told them the truth I'd learned: that love without respect is just manipulation with better marketing. Susan raised her glass to that. She told us about her son who'd stolen her identity to open credit cards, how she'd had to prosecute her own child to protect herself. Patricia's daughter hadn't spoken to her in 5 years over an inheritance dispute with Patricia's sister. Margaret's son was fine, but her daughter treated her like free childcare with no appreciation. We were 6 women with nearly 450 years of combined life experience, and every single one of us had been hurt by our own children. The odds seemed impossible until you realized that we'd raised our kids in a culture that taught them to value independence and success over family bonds, then acted surprised when they chose ambition over loyalty. But we'd survived. We were here, on a ship in the Caribbean, having chosen ourselves, and that mattered. Day 9 of the cruise brought us to St. Lucia, and I woke up to an email that changed everything. It was from Patrick, marked urgent, sent at 4 a.m. Portland time. He'd attached several documents and a voice memo explaining what he'd discovered. David had filed a petition with the county court. He was seeking an emergency psychological evaluation of me, claiming I'd shown signs of dementia, made irrational financial decisions, and posed a danger to myself. He'd submitted statements from 3 people: Stephanie's mother, and remarkably, one of my neighbors, Mrs. Chen from 2 houses down. I sat on my balcony in my bathrobe, reading through the petition with shaking hands. David had twisted every interaction we'd had over the past year into evidence of my declining mind. He claimed I'd forgotten conversations we'd had, repeated myself constantly, and had become paranoid and suspicious. He stated that canceling the cruise impulsively and taking strangers instead of family showed a break from reality. The neighbor's statement was particularly painful. Mrs. Chen, who I'd helped after her husband died, who I'd brought meals to during her recovery from hip surgery, had told David she'd noticed I seemed confused about what day it was and talked to myself in the garden. I did talk to Richard's roses while I gardened. It was how I processed grief, how I kept his memory alive. David had turned my morning ritual into evidence of insanity. Patrick's voice memo was calm but firm. He told me the petition would fail, had my cognitive evaluation, my documented planning, and the fact that I was successfully managing an international trip. But the attempt itself was telling. David wasn't trying to reconcile or apologize. He was trying to take control of my life, my assets, my autonomy. Patrick had already filed a response and scheduled a hearing for 2 days after my return. He'd also done something I hadn't asked for but desperately needed. He'd contacted Adult Protective Services to document David's pattern of financial exploitation attempts. This wasn't just about protecting my money anymore. This was about protecting my freedom. I must have been sitting there for an hour when Helen knocked on my door. She took one look at me and came straight to the balcony, read the documents without saying a word, then pulled me into a hug that lasted until I finally let myself cry. She told me something I needed to hear. She said that the hardest part of her battle with Melissa had been accepting that her daughter was willing to destroy her to get what she wanted. That's what David was doing. He was willing to have me declared incompetent, to take away my rights, to institutionalize me if necessary, all because I'd stopped funding his lifestyle. We skipped the morning excursion. Instead, Helen and I spent 3 hours on the phone with Patrick, going through every piece of evidence, every document, every interaction. He'd been thorough. He had my phone records showing I'd made coherent plans, my credit card statements showing responsible spending, even a statement from Carlo the steward about how organized and clear-minded I'd been throughout the trip. But Patrick warned me about what came next. He said David would likely escalate when the petition failed. The court hearing would be ugly. David would say terrible things, make accusations, try to paint me as a vindictive old woman punishing her son for imagined slights. I needed to be prepared to sit in a courtroom and hear my own child testify that I was mentally unfit. That afternoon, I made a decision. I gathered our group of 6 and told them everything, not just about the cruise situation, but about the petition, about David's financial problems, about what I was facing when I got home. I'd been protecting them from the full ugliness of it, not wanting to ruin the trip, but I needed them to understand. Diane spoke first. She told me that her grandson had tried something similar with her brother, got an attorney involved, caused a family war that ended with the boy getting nothing and the relationships destroyed. She said the key was documentation and witnesses. Then she asked if I needed character witnesses for the hearing. One by one, they all volunteered. These women who'd known me for decades, who'd watched me care for Richard through his final illness, who'd seen me manage my finances and my life with competence and grace. They would stand up in court and testify to my mental fitness if needed. I cried again, but this time from gratitude instead of grief. That evening, I did something I'd been avoiding. I called David, not to argue or defend myself, but to say what needed to be said while I still had the courage. He answered immediately, his voice cold and formal. He told me he'd tried to protect me from this, but my behavior had left him no choice. He said he loved me, but couldn't stand by while I destroyed myself. He actually managed to sound convinced of his own righteousness. I let him finish. Then I told him the truth in the calmest voice I could manage. I told him I knew about his debts, about the second mortgage, about the maxed credit cards. I told him I understood he was desperate and scared, but I would not be his solution. I would not allow him to strip away my autonomy because he'd made poor financial choices. He tried to interrupt, but I kept going. I told him that his father would be ashamed of what he'd become, that Richard had worked himself to exhaustion to give David opportunities, and David had squandered them all while expecting his elderly mother to clean up the mess. Then I told him about the will. Patrick had advised against it, but I needed David to understand there was no path forward where manipulating me would work. I told him he'd inherit exactly $8,500, the price of the cruise he'd felt entitled to steal from me. The rest would go to causes his father would have supported, places where money created opportunity instead of enabling entitlement. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought he'd hung up. Then he spoke, and his voice was different, raw and broken. He told me I was destroying our family over money, that I was choosing pride over my own son, that I'd regret this when I was dying alone. I told him I'd rather die alone with my dignity than live surrounded by people who saw me as nothing but an inheritance to wait for. He hung up without another word. I stood on my balcony watching the sunset paint the Caribbean in shades of orange and gold, and I felt something shift inside me. The guilt was gone, the doubt was gone. All that remained was clarity, the kind that comes from finally understanding that some relationships are too broken to fix, and trying only damages you further. Tomorrow we'd reach our final port. 2 days after that, I'd be home facing a court hearing where my son would try to have me declared incompetent. But tonight, I was a woman who'd finally learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, with fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill, and wooden benches that reminded me of church pews from my childhood. I sat next to Patrick in my navy blue suit, the one I'd worn to Richard's funeral, with Helen directly behind me for support. Across the aisle sat David and Stephanie with their attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s who kept whispering to them and shuffling papers. I hadn't seen my son in person since before the cruise, nearly 3 weeks ago. He looked terrible thinner, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that made him fidget constantly. Stephanie looked furious, her jaw clenched so tight I wondered if her teeth hurt. Neither of them would meet my eyes. Judge Carolyn Morrison entered, and we all stood. She was probably 60, with steel-gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd heard every family horror story imaginable and wasn't impressed by any of them. Patrick had told me she was known for being fair but no nonsense, and that she particularly disliked adult children who wasted the court's time with frivolous petitions against their elderly parents. David's attorney went first. Her name was Jennifer Walsh, and she painted a picture of me that was almost unrecognizably a confused widow making increasingly erratic decisions, canceling family plans impulsively, showing signs of paranoia and memory loss. She called Mrs. Chen to testify first. My neighbor took the stand looking uncomfortable. She testified that she'd noticed me talking to myself in the garden, that I'd seemed to forget what day it was when she'd asked me on several occasions, and that I'd become more isolated after Richard's death. Under cross-examination from Patrick, things fell apart quickly. He asked her when specifically these incidents had occurred. She couldn't remember. He asked if she'd ever seen me actually confused about my surroundings or unable to care for myself. She admitted she hadn't. He asked if talking to plants while gardening was particularly unusual for someone processing grief. She hesitated, then admitted her own mother had done the same thing. Patrick pulled out photos from my cruise, me parasailing in Grand Cayman. All 6 of us at a cooking class in Cozumel, our group navigating the streets of St. Lucia with a map I'd researched and printed. He asked Mrs. Chen if this looked like someone incapable of managing her own affairs. She looked at David apologetically and said no, it didn't. Then Stephanie took the stand. She was more prepared, more convincing. She testified that I'd always been controlling with David, that I'd never accepted their marriage, and that canceling the cruise was part of a pattern of manipulation and punishment. She cried when she described how I'd abandoned my son over a simple misunderstanding, how I was tearing the family apart with my stubbornness. Patrick let her talk. Then, he asked her one simple question. Mrs. Reynolds, who paid for the cruise that was cancelled? She hesitated. Barbara did, but it was supposed to be a family trip, and who legally owned those reservations? Well, Barbara, but David had arranged everything. Had your husband contributed any money to this cruise? Her face flushed. We were going to pay Barbara back. That wasn't my question. Did your husband pay for any portion of this cruise? No. But Patrick cut her off gently. And when your husband called to disinvite his mother from a trip she'd fully paid for, did you consider that kind or appropriate? Jennifer Walsh objected, but the damage was done. The judge had been taking notes, and I saw her eyebrows raise slightly. Then David testified. My son took the stand and looked directly at the judge, avoiding my eyes completely. He talked about how I'd changed after his father died, become more paranoid and suspicious. He said I'd always been forgetful, but it had gotten worse. He claimed he'd only asked me to pay for the cruise because I'd offered, and that my reaction to a simple scheduling change showed mental instability. Patrick stood for cross-examination, and I saw David's confidence waver. Patrick asked about his financial situation, the credit card debt, the missed payments, the second mortgage. David claimed that was irrelevant. Patrick asked how many times in the past 2 years David had asked me for money. David said he didn't keep count, that family helped each other. Patrick asked if David had ever paid any of it back. David said he'd intended to. Then Patrick did something brilliant. He asked David to describe the conversation where he'd simply suggested a scheduling change. David recounted his version that he'd gently proposed I might be more comfortable at home, that 3 cabins seemed excessive, that he'd wanted intimate family time. Patrick pulled out his phone and played a recording. My voice came through the courtroom speakers clearly. David, are you really uninviting your mother from a trip she paid for completely so your wife's parents can go instead? Then David's voice, cold and dismissive. Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're retired. You can travel anytime. This is important to us. I watched my son's face turn red. Jennifer Walsh jumped up, objecting that the recording was inadmissible. But Patrick calmly explained that Oregon's one-party consent law made it perfectly legal, and he'd submitted it as evidence days ago. Judge Morrison asked to hear it again. The courtroom was silent except for David's voice telling me I'd already had my life, that I should let them enjoy theirs. When it finished, the judge looked at my son with an expression I can only describe as disgusted. Patrick presented my cognitive evaluation, next pages of test results showing superior mental function for my age. He showed my meticulous cruise planning, my detailed financial records, character testimony from Helen and the other bridge ladies. He presented my phone records showing coherent conversations with doctors, attorneys, travel agents. He even had a statement from Carlo, the cruise steward, describing me as one of the most organized and pleasant passengers he'd served. Finally, Patrick asked if I wanted to testify. I said yes. I took the stand and told the truth. I explained that I'd spent 73 years learning to trust my judgment, and my judgment told me David saw me as a source of money rather than a person deserving respect. I described the pattern of requests, followed by distance, the way he'd use affection as currency. I talked about Richard, about how we'd sacrificed for decades to build something meaningful, and how I wouldn't dishonor his memory by letting our son manipulate me. I looked directly at David for the first time and told him I loved him, that I'd always love him, but that love didn't mean accepting abuse. I told him that protecting my autonomy and dignity wasn't mental illness, it was self. Jennifer Walsh tried to make me sound vindictive during her questions, but I stayed calm. I explained that my will reflected my values, that the scholarship fund honored Richard's belief in education, that the elder abuse organizations addressed a problem I now understood personally. I told her that leaving David $8,500 wasn't punishment, it was a lesson about the cost of treating your parents like ATMs. Judge Morrison asked everyone to sit. She didn't need time to deliberate. She looked at David and told him that his petition was not only denied but was one of the most transparent attempts at financial manipulation she'd seen in 20 years on the bench. She said that his mother had demonstrated exceptional mental capacity and judgment, and that his attempt to have her declared incompetent bordered on elder abuse. Then she did something I didn't expect. She ordered David to pay my legal fees and issued a protective order preventing him from filing any similar petitions without substantial new evidence. She told him that adult children who tried to control their elderly parents' finances through the legal system were committing a form of violence, and she wouldn't enable it. David's face went white. Stephanie started crying. Their attorney gathered her papers quickly, clearly wanting to escape. As we left the courtroom, David called out to me. His voice was broken, desperate. He said he was sorry, that he'd made mistakes, that he wanted to fix this. I stopped and turned to face him. For just a moment, I saw the boy he'd been, scared and small and lost. But then I saw the man he'd chosen to become, and I knew that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. I told him that sorry didn't undo the damage, that apologies without changed behavior were just manipulation with different words. I told him I hoped he'd find his way eventually, but that I wouldn't be his stepping stone to get there. Then I walked out of that courthouse with Patrick and Helen on either side of me, and I didn't look back. 6 months have passed since that courtroom, and I'm sitting in my garden on a crisp October morning, watching the roses Richard planted bloom one last time before winter. The house is quiet, but it's a different kind of quiet, now peaceful, instead of lonely, chosen, instead of imposed. David tried to contact me 17 times in the first month after the hearing. Texts, emails, even a handwritten letter that arrived on what would have been Richard's 78th birthday. Each message followed the same pattern: apologies, mixed with justifications, claims that he'd changed, mixed with subtle requests for reconciliation that always seemed to circle back to his financial situation. I didn't respond to any of them. Patrick advised me that engaging would only restart the cycle, and Helen reminded me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the full consequences of their choices. David had spent years learning that his mother would always cave, always forgive, always provide. He needed to learn something different now. The last I heard through mutual acquaintances, David and Stephanie had separated. The financial pressure combined with the humiliation of the court case had apparently fractured whatever their relationship was built on. He'd moved into a small apartment and taken a second job. Part of me, the mother part that never fully goes away, felt a pang of concern, but the woman I'd become understood that this was his path to walk, not mine to smooth. The scholarship fund in Richard's name awarded its first grants last month. 3 students from working-class families, studying engineering, receiving money that would have gone to a son who'd squandered every opportunity his parents had given him. I attended the awards ceremony and met these young people, hungry, grateful, determined. One girl reminded me so much of myself at 19, before I met Richard. When I was working 2 jobs to pay for community college, I saw in her eyes what David had lost: the understanding that opportunity is precious because it's hard-won. The elder abuse organization I'd donated to asked me to speak at their annual fundraiser. I told my story to a room full of people, and afterward, 7 women came up to me in tears. Each one had a similar tale: children who'd manipulated, exploited, or outright stolen from aging parents. We exchanged numbers, formed a support group. Now we meet monthly, 8 women between 65 and 82. Helping each other navigate the painful reality that sometimes your own children are the ones you need protection from. Helen and I took another trip last month, just the 2 of us this time. We went to Greece, ate too much baklava, toured ancient ruins, and laughed until our faces hurt. One evening in Santorini, watching the sunset paint the white buildings gold, she told me she was proud of me. She said that watching me stand up to David had given her the courage to finally cut off Melissa completely after years of half measures. We toasted to that with local wine. 2 old widows who'd finally learned that self-preservation wasn't selfishness. My relationship with the other bridge ladies has deepened too. We're not just friends anymore. We're survivors, warriors. Women who've learned that 70+ years on this earth earns you the right to demand respect. We still play cards every Thursday, but now we also share legal referrals, discuss estate planning, and support each other through family complications. Margaret's daughter finally apologized last month after 2 years of silence. Patricia's son is in therapy dealing with his entitlement issues. Susan's grandson started visiting her regularly, having watched what happened with his uncle and learned from it. I've made peace with the likelihood that David and I may never reconcile. Some people think that's tragic, that family should forgive anything, but I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, and love doesn't require accepting abuse. I can love the boy David was while protecting myself from the man he became. I can hope he finds his way while refusing to be his doormat on the journey. The house in Portland is still mine, paid off and peaceful. I've redecorated Richard's study, turned it into a reading room with big windows and comfortable chairs. I volunteer at the library twice a week, helping seniors learn to use computers, teaching them the same digital literacy that helped me document my case against David. I've taken up watercolor painting, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. At 73, I'm busier and happier than I've been in a decade. Mrs. Chen apologized to me 3 months ago, came to my door in tears, saying David had pressured her and she'd felt cornered. I forgave her because her situation was different from his. She'd been manipulated, not malicious. We're not close friends, but we're neighborly again. She brings me tomatoes from her garden, and I share my roses. My will is finalized and filed. $8,500 for David, enough to sting but not destroy. Enough to make the point without being cruel. The rest divided between the scholarship fund, elder abuse organizations, and a trust that will maintain Richard's grave in perpetuity. David will inherit the memory of what he could have had and the lesson about what happens when you treat people as resources instead of humans. I think about Richard constantly. Sometimes I still talk to his roses while I garden, tell him about my days, ask his advice, even though I know the answers now come from my own wisdom. I think he'd be proud of how I handled everything: the cruise, the court case, the boundaries I've finally learned to set. Richard always said I was stronger than I believed. It took losing him and nearly losing myself to David's manipulation to finally prove him right. This morning, I received an email from one of the scholarship recipients. She's doing well in her engineering program, wants to specialize in sustainable infrastructure. She thanked me again for the opportunity, said that people like me and my late husband gave her hope that good people still existed. I cried reading it, but they were good tears, the kind that come from knowing your choices matter, that your life means something beyond being useful to people who should have loved you better. I'm writing this from my garden, the October sun warm on my face, the roses bright against the fence. In an hour, Helen will pick me up for lunch. This afternoon, I have an appointment with Patrick to discuss setting up a small foundation, something more permanent than just donations. Something that will outlive me and continue Richard's legacy of creating opportunities for others. I'm 73 years old. My son doesn't speak to me. My husband has been gone for 4 years, and I am more at peace than I've ever been. If this story touched you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below, and subscribe to this channel, because there are so many stories like mine that need to be told. So many older women finding their voices and their strength after years of being diminished. We're not invisible, not used up, not confused or incompetent. We're survivors who've learned that respect isn't given freely. Sometimes you have to demand it, even from your own children, especially from your own children. They thought I was just a helpless old woman with outdated ideas and failing memory. They learned I was a woman with 7 decades of wisdom, the kind you can't fake and can't manipulate away. I was a woman who'd loved deeply, lost much, and finally understood that protecting your dignity isn't cruel, it's necessary. My name is Barbara Reynolds. I'm 73 years old, and I chose myself. That choice saved my life.